Book 3, Chapter 7 of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Women's Revolution, Chapter 7. The 2 months of the summer of 1913 which were spent with my daughter in Paris were almost the last days of peace and rest I have been destined since to enjoy. I spent the days, or some hours of them, in the initial preparation of this volume, because it seemed to me that I had a duty to perform in giving to the world my own plain statement of the events which have led up to the Women's Revolution in England. Other histories of the militant movement will undoubtedly be written, in times to come, when in all constitutional countries of the world women's votes will be as universally accepted as men's votes are now, when men and women occupy the world of industry on equal terms, as co-workers rather than as cut-throat competitors, when, in a word, all the dreadful and criminal discriminations which exist now between the sexes are abolished, as they must one day be abolished, the historian will be able to sit down in leisurely fashion and do full justice to the strange story of how the women of England took up arms against the blind and obstinate government of England and fought their way to political freedom. I should like to live long enough to read such a history, calmly considered, carefully analyzed, conscientiously set forth. It will be a better book to read than this one, written as it were in camp between battles. But perhaps this one, hastily prepared as it has been, will give the reader of the future a clearer impression of the strenuousness and the desperation of the conflict, and also something of the heretofore undreamed of courage and fighting strength of women, who, having learned the joy of battle, lose all sense of fear and continue their struggle up to and past the gates of death, never flinching at any step of the way. Every step since that meeting in October 1912, when we definitely declared war on the peace of England, has been beset with danger and difficulty, often unexpected and undeclared. In October 1913 I sailed in the French liner La Provence for my third visit to the United States. My intention was published in the public press of England, France, and America. No attempt of concealment of my purpose was made, and in fact my departure was witnessed by 2 men from Scotland Yard. Some hints had reached my ear that an attempt would be made by immigration officers at the port in New York to exclude me as an undesirable alien, but I gave little credit to these reports. American friends wrote and cabled encouraging words, and so I passed my time aboard ship quite peacefully, working part of the time, resting also against the fatigue always attendant on a lecture tour. When I came to anchor in the harbor of New York on October 26th, there, to my astonishment, the immigration authorities notified me that I was ordered to Ellis Island to appear before a board of special inquiry. The officers who served the order of detention did so with all courtesy, even with a certain air of reluctance. They allowed my American traveling companion, Mrs. Rita Childor, to accompany me to the island, but no one, not even the solicitor sent by Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont to defend me, was permitted to attend me before the Board of Special Inquiry. I went before these 3 men quite alone, as many a poor, friendless woman, without any of my resources, has had to appear. The moment of my entrance to the room I knew that extraordinary means had been employed against me, for on the desk behind which the board sat I saw a complete dossier of my case in English legal papers. These papers may have been supplied by Scotland Yard, or they may have been supplied by the government. I cannot tell, of course. They sufficed to convince the Board of Special Inquiry that I was a person of doubtful character, to say the least of it, and that I was informed that I should have to be detained until the higher authorities at Washington examined my case. Everything was done to make me comfortable, the rooms of the Commissioner of Immigration being turned over to me and my companion. The very men who found me guilty of moral obloquy, something of which no British jury has ever yet accused me, put themselves out in a number of ways to make my detention agreeable. I was escorted all over the island, and through the quarters assigned detained immigrants, whose right to land in the United States is in question. The huge dining rooms, the spotless kitchens, and the admirably varied bill of fare interested and impressed me. Nothing like them exists in any English institution. I remained at Ellis Island 2½ days, long enough for the Commissioner of Immigration at Washington to take my case to the President, who instantly ordered my release. Whoever was responsible for my detention entirely overlooked the advertising value of the incident. My lecture tour was made much more successful for it, and I embarked for England late in November with a very generous American contribution to our war chest, a contribution, alas, that I was not permitted to deliver in person. The night before the White Star liner Majestic reached Plymouth, a wireless message from headquarters informed me that the government had decided to arrest me on my arrival. The arrest was made, under very dramatic conditions, the next day shortly before noon. The steamer came to anchor in the outer harbor, and we saw at once that the bay, usually so animated with passing vessels, had been cleared of all craft. Far in the distance, the tender, on which other occasions had always met the steamer, rested at anchor between 2 huge grey warships. For a moment or two the scene halted, the passengers crowding to the deck rails in speechless curiosity to see what was to happen next. Suddenly a fisherman's dory, power-driven, dashed across the harbour directly under the noses of the grim war vessels. 2 women, spray-drenched, stood up in the boat, and as it ploughed swiftly past our steamer the women called out to me, "The cats are here, Mrs. Pankhurst. They're close on you." Their voices trailed away into the mist and we heard no more. Within a minute or two a frightened ship's boy appeared on deck and delivered a message from the purser asking me to step down to his office. I answered that I would certainly do nothing of the kind, and next the police swarmed out on deck, and I heard, for the 5th time, that I was arrested under the Cat and Mouse Act. They had sent 5 men from Scotland Yard, 2 men from Plymouth, and a wardress from Holloway, a sufficient number, it will be allowed, to take 1 woman from a ship anchored 2 miles out at sea. Following my firm resolve not to assist in any way the enforcement of the infamous law, I refused to go with men, who thereupon picked me up and carried me to the waiting police tender. We steamed some miles up the Cornish coast, the police refusing absolutely to tell me whither they were conveying me, and finally disembarked at Bull Point, a government landing stage, closed to the general public. Here a motor car was waiting, and accompanied by my bodyguard from Scotland Yard and Holloway, I was driven across Dartmoor to Exeter, where I had a not unendurable imprisonment and hunger strike of 4 days. Everyone from the governor of the prison to the wardresses were openly sympathetic and kind, and I was told by one confidential official that they kept me only because they had orders to do so until after the great meeting at Empress Theatre, Earl's Court, London, which had been arranged as a welcome home for me. The meeting was held on the Sunday night following my arrest, and the great sum of £15,000 was poured into the coffers of militancy. This included the £4,500 which had been collected during my American tour. Several days after my release from Exeter, I went openly to Paris to confer with my daughter on matters relating to the campaign about to open, returning to attend a WSPU meeting on the day before my license expired. Nevertheless, the boat train carriage in which I travelled with my doctor and nurse was invaded at Dover town by 2 detectives who told me to consider myself under arrest. We were making tea when the men entered, but this we immediately threw out of the window because a hunger strike always began at the instant of arrest. We never compromised at all, but resisted from the very first moment of attack. The reason for this uncalled-for arrest at Dover was the fear on the part of the police of the bodyguard of women, just then organized for the express purpose of resisting attempts to arrest me. That the police, as well as the government, were afraid to resist encountering women, who were not afraid to fight, we had abundant testimony. We certainly had it on this occasion, for knowing that the bodyguard was waiting at Victoria Station, the authorities had cut off all approaches to the arrival platform, and the place was guarded by battalions of police. Not a passenger was permitted to leave a carriage until I had been carried across the arrival platform between a double line of police and detectives and thrown into a 40-horsepower motor car, guarded within by 2 plainclothes men and a wardress, and without by 3 more policemen. Around this motor car were 12 taxicabs filled with plainclothes men, 4 to each vehicle, and 3 guarding the outside, not to mention the driver, who was also in the employ of the police department. Detectives on motorcycles were on guard at various points, ready to follow any rescuing taxicab. Arrived at Holloway, I was again lifted from the car and taken to the reception room and placed on the floor in a state of great exhaustion. When the doctor came in and told me curtly to stand up, I was obliged to tell him that I could not stand. I utterly refused to be examined, saying that I was resolved to make the government assume full responsibility for my condition. I refuse to be examined by you or any other prison doctor, I declared, and I do this as a protest against my sentence, and against my being here at all. I no longer recognize a prison doctor as a medical man in the proper sense of the word. I have withdrawn my consent to be governed by the rules of prison. I refuse to recognize the authority of any prison official, and I therefore make it impossible for the government to carry out the sentence they have imposed upon me. Wardresses were summoned. I was placed in an invalid chair, and so carried up 3 flights of stairs, and put into an unwarmed cell with a concrete floor. Refusing to leave the chair, I was lifted out and placed on the bed, where I lay all night without removing my coat or loosening my garments. It was on a Saturday that the arrest had been made, and I was kept in prison until the following Wednesday morning. During all that time no food or water passed my lips, and I added to this the sleep strike, which means that as far as was humanly possible I refused all sleep and rest. For 2 nights I sat or lay on the concrete floor, resolutely refusing the oft-repeated offers of medical examination. "You are not a doctor," I told the man. "You are a government torturer, and all you want to do is satisfy yourself that I am not quite ready to die." The doctor, a new man since my last imprisonment, flushed and looked extremely unhappy. "I suppose you do think that," he mumbled. On Tuesday morning the governor came to look at me, and no doubt I presented by that time a fairly bad appearance. At least I gathered as much from the alarmed expression of the wardress who accompanied him. To the governor I made the simple announcement that I was ready to leave prison, and that I intended to leave very soon, dead or alive. I told him that from that moment I should not even rest on the concrete floor, but should walk my cell until I was released or until I died from exhaustion. All day I kept to this resolution, pacing up and down the narrow cell, many times stumbling and falling, until the doctor came in at evening to tell me I was ordered released on the following morning. Then I loosened my gown and lay down, absolutely spent, and fell almost instantly into a death-like sleep. The next morning a motor ambulance took me to the Kingsway headquarters, where a hospital room had been arranged for my reception. The 2 imprisonments in less than 10 days had made terrible drafts on my strength, and the coldness of the Holloway cell had brought on a painful neuralgia. It was many days before I recovered even a tithe of my usual health. These 2 arrests resulted exactly as the government should have known that they would result, in a great outbreak of fresh militancy. As soon as the news spread that I had been taken at Plymouth, a huge fire broke out in the timber yards at Richmond Walk, Davenport, and an acre and a half of timber, beside a pleasant fair and a scenic railway adjacent, to the value of thousands of pounds, was destroyed. No one ever discovered the cause of the fire, the greatest that ever occurred in the neighbourhood, but tied to one of the railings was a copy of the Suffragette, and to another railing 2 cards, on one of which was written a message to the government. "How dare you arrest Mrs. Pankhurst and allow Sir Edward Carson and Mr. Bonar Law to go free?" The second card bore the words, "Our reply to the tortured Mrs. Pankhurst, and her cowardly arrest at Plymouth." Besides this fire, which waged fiercely from midnight until dawn, a large unoccupied house at Bristol was destroyed by fire, a fine residence in Scotland, also unoccupied, badly damaged by fire. St. Anne's Church, in a suburb of Liverpool, was partly destroyed, and many pillar boxes in London, Edinburgh, Derby, and other cities were fired. In churches all over the kingdom our women created consternation by interpolating into the services reverently spoken prayers for prisoners who were suffering for conscience' sake. The reader has no doubt heard of these interruptions, and if so he has read of brawling, shrieking women breaking into the sanctity of religious services and creating riot in the house of God. I think the reader should know exactly what does happen when militants, who are usually religious women, interrupt church services. On the Sunday when I was in Holloway, following my arrest at Dover, certain women attending the afternoon service at Westminster Abbey chanted in concert the following prayer: "God save Emmeline Pankhurst. Help us with thy love and strength to guard her. Spare those who suffer for conscience sake. Hear us when we pray to thee." They had hardly finished this prayer when vergers fell upon them and with great violence hustled them out of the abbey. One kneeling man, who happened to be near one of the women, forgot his Christian intercessions long enough to beat her in the face with his fists before the vergers came. Similar scenes have taken place in churches and cathedrals throughout England and Scotland, and in many instances the women have been most barbarously treated by vergers and members of the congregations. In other cases the women not only have been left unmolested, but have been allowed to finish their prayers amid deep and sympathetic silence. Some clergymen have even been brave enough to add a reverent amen to these prayers for women in prison, and it has happened that clergymen have voluntarily offered prayers for us. The Church as a whole, however, has undoubtedly failed to live up to its obligation to demand justice for women, and to protect against the torture of forcible feeding. During the year just closing, we sent many deputations to church authorities, the bishops, one after another, having been visited in this manner. Some of the bishops, including the reactionary Archbishop of Canterbury, refused to accord the desired interview, and when that happened, the answer of the deputation was to sit on the doorstep of the episcopal residence until surrender followed, as it invariably did. As Holloway Gaol is within its diocese, the Bishop of London was visited by the WSPU, and the demand was made that the bishop himself should witness forcible feeding in order to realize the horror of the proceeding. He did visit 2 of the tortured women, but he did not see them forcibly fed, and when he came out he gave the public an account of his interview with them, which was in effect the government's version of the facts. The WSPU was naturally indignant, while all the government's friends hailed the bishop as a supporter of the policy of torture. Only those who have suffered the pain and agony, not to speak of the moral humiliation of forcible feeding, can realize the depths of the inquiry which the Bishop of London was manoeuvred by the government to whitewash. It may be true, as the bishop comforted himself by saying, that the victims of forcible feeding suffered the more because they struggled under the process. But as Mary Richardson wrote in the Suffragette, to expect a victim not to struggle was the same as telling her that she would suffer less if she did not jump on getting a cinder in her eye. The principle, declared Miss Richardson, is the same. One struggles because the pain is excruciating, and the nerves of the eyes and face are so tortured that it would be impossible not to resist to the uttermost. One struggles also because of another reason, a moral reason, for forcible feeding is an immoral assault as well as a painful physical one, and to remain passive under it would give one the feeling of sin, the sin of concurrence. One's whole nature is revolted, resistance is therefore inevitable. I think it proper here to explain also the policy upon which we embarked in 1914 of taking our cause directly to the King. The reader has perhaps heard of suffragette insults to King George and Queen Mary, and it is but just that he should hear a direct account of how these insults are offered. Several isolated attempts had been made to present petitions to the king, once when he was on his way to Westminster to open Parliament, and again on an occasion when he paid a visit to Bristol. On the latter occasion the woman who tried to present the petition was assaulted by one of the king's equerries, who struck her with the flat of his sword. We finally resolved on the policy of direct petition to the king because we had been forced to abandon all hope of successful petitioning to his ministers. Tricked and betrayed at every turn by the Liberal government, we announced that we would not again put even a pretense of confidence in them. We would carry our demand for justice to the throne of the monarch. Late in December 1913, while I was in prison for the second time since my return to England, a great gala performance was given at Covent Garden, an opera being the Jeanne d'Arc of Raymond Rosé. The king and queen and the entire court were present, and the scene was expected to be one of unusual brilliance. Our women took advantage of the occasion to make one of the most successful demonstrations of the year. A box was secured directly opposite the royal box, and this was occupied by 3 women, beautifully gowned. On entering they had managed, without attracting the slightest attention, to lock and barricade the door, and at the close of the first act, as soon as the orchestra had disappeared, the women stood up, and one of them, with the aid of a megaphone, addressed the king. Calling attention to the impressive scenes on the stage, the speaker told the king that women were today fighting, as Joan of Arc fought centuries ago, for human liberty, and that they, like the Maid of Orleans, were being tortured and done to death, in the name of the king, in the name of the church, and with the full knowledge and responsibility of established government. At this very hour the leader of these fighters in the Army of Liberty was being held in prison and tortured by the king's authority. The vast audience was thrown into a panic of excitement and horror, and amid a perfect turmoil of cries and adjurations, the door of the box was finally broken down and the women ejected. As soon as they had left the house, others of our women, to the number of 40 or more, who had been sitting quietly in an upper gallery, rose to their feet and rained suffrage literature on the heads of the audience below. It was fully 3/4 of an hour before the excitement subsided and the singers could go on with the opera. The sensation caused by this direct address to royalty inspired us to make a second attempt to arouse the king's conscience, and early in January, as soon as Parliament reassembled, we announced that I would personally lead a deputation to Buckingham Palace. The plan was welcomed with enthusiasm by our members, and a very large number of women volunteered to join the deputation, which was intended to make a protest against 3 things: the continued disenfranchisement of women, the forcible feeding and the cat-and-mouse torture of those who were fighting against this injustice, and the scandalous manner in which the government, while coercing and torturing militant women, were allowing perfect freedom to the men opponents of Home Rule in Ireland, men who openly announced that they were about to carry out a policy not merely of attacking property, but of destroying human life. I wrote a letter to the king conveying to him the respectful and loyal request of the Women's Social and Political Union that your Majesty will give audience to a deputation of women. The letter went on: the deputation desire to submit to your Majesty in person their claim to the parliamentary vote, which is the only protection against the grievous industrial and social wrongs that women suffer, is the symbol and guarantee of British citizenship, and means the recognition of women's equal dignity and worth as members of our great empire. The deputation will further lay before your Majesty a complaint of the medieval and barbarous methods of torture whereby your Majesty's ministers are seeking to repress women's revolt against the deprivation of citizen rights, a revolt as noble and glorious in its spirit and purpose as any of those past struggles for liberty which are the pride of the British race. We have been told by the unthinking, by those who are heedless of the constitutional principles upon which is based our loyal request for an audience of your Majesty in person, that our conversation should be with your Majesty's ministers. We repudiate this suggestion. In the first place, it would not only be repugnant to our womanly sense of dignity, but it would be absurd and futile for us to interview the very men against whom we bring the accusations of betraying the women's cause, and torturing those who fight for that cause. In the second place, we will not be referred to, and we will not recognize the authority of men who, in our eyes, have no legal or constitutional standing in the matter, because we have not been consulted as to their election to Parliament, nor as to their appointment as ministers of the Crown. I then cited as a precedent, in support of our claim to be heard by the king in person, the case of the deputation of Irish Catholics, which, in the year 1793, was received by King George III in person. I further said, our right as women to be heard and to be aided by your Majesty is far stronger than any such right possessed by men, because it is based upon our lack of every other constitutional means of securing the redress of our grievances. We have no power to vote for members of Parliament, and therefore for us there is no House of Commons. We have no voice in the House of Lords, but we have a king, and to him we make our appeal. Constitutionally speaking, we are, as voteless women, living in the time when the power of the monarchy was unlimited, in that old time which is past for men, though not for women. Men who were oppressed had recourse to the king, the source of power, of justice, and of reform. Precisely in the same way we now claim the right to come to the foot of the throne, and to make of the king in person our demand for the redress of the political grievance which we cannot and will not any longer tolerate. Because women are voteless, there are in our midst today sweated workers, white slaves, outraged children, and innocent mothers and their babies stricken by horrible disease. It is for the sake and in the cause of these unhappy members of our sex that we ask of your Majesty the audience that we are confident will be granted to us. It was some days before we had the answer to this letter, and in the meantime some uncommonly stirring and painful occurrences attracted the public attention. End of Book 3, Chapter 7. Book 3, Chapter 8 of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Women's Revolution, Chapter 8. For months before my return to England from my American lecture tour, the Ulster situation had been increasingly serious. Sir Edward Carson and his followers had declared that if Home Rule government should be created and set up in Dublin, they would, law or no law, establish a rival and independent government in Ulster. It was known that arms and ammunition were being shipped to Ireland, and that men, and women too for that matter, were drilling and otherwise getting ready for civil war. The WSPU approached Sir Edward Carson and asked him if the proposed Ulster government would give equal voting rights to women. We frankly declared that in case the Ulster men alone were to have the vote, that we should deal with King Carson and his colleagues exactly in the same manner that we had adopted towards the British government centred at Westminster. Sir Edward Carson at first promised us that the rebel Ulster government, should it come into existence, would give votes to Ulster women. This pledge was later repudiated, and in the early winter months of 1914 militancy appeared in Ulster. It had been raging in Scotland for some time, and now the imprisoned suffragettes in that country were being forcibly fed as in England. The answer to this was, of course, more militancy. The ancient Scottish church of Whitekirk, a relic of pre-Reformation days, was destroyed by fire. Several unoccupied country houses were also burned. It was about this time, February 1914, that I undertook a series of meetings outside London, the first of which was to be held in Glasgow, in the St. Andrew's Hall, which holds many thousands of people. In order that I might be free on the night of the meeting, I left London unknown to the police in a motor car. In spite of all efforts to apprehend me, I succeeded in reaching Glasgow and in getting to the platform of St. Andrew's, where I found myself face to face with an enormous and manifestly sympathetic audience. As it was suspected that the police might rush the platform, plans had been made to offer resistance, and the bodyguard was present in force. My speech was one of the shortest I have ever made. I said, "I have kept my promise, and in spite of His Majesty's government I am here tonight. Very few people in this audience, very few people in this country, know how much of the nation's money is being spent to silence women. But the wit and ingenuity of women is overcoming the power and money of the British government. It is well that we should have this meeting tonight, because today is a memorable day in the annals of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Today in the House of Commons has been witnessed the triumph of militancy, men's militancy, and tonight I hope to make it clear to the people in this meeting that if there is any distinction to be drawn at all between militancy in Ulster and the militancy of women, it is all to the advantage of the women. Our greatest task in this women's movement is to prove that we are human beings like men, and every stage of our fight is forcing home that very difficult lesson into the minds of men, and especially into the minds of politicians. I propose tonight at this political meeting to have a text. Texts are usually given from pulpits, but perhaps you will forgive me if I have a text tonight. My text is, equal justice for men and women, equal political justice, equal legal justice, equal industrial justice, and equal social justice. I want as clearly and as briefly as I can to make it clear to you tonight that if it is justifiable to fight for common, ordinary, equal justice, then women have ample justification, nay, have greater justification, for revolution and rebellion than ever men have had in the whole history of the human race. Now that is a big contention to make, but I am going to prove it. You get the proof of the political injustice." As I finished the word injustice, a steward uttered a warning shout, there was a tramp of heavy feet, and a large body of police burst into the hall, and rushed up to the platform, drawing their truncheons as they ran. Headed by detectives from Scotland Yard, they surged in on all sides, but as the foremost members attempted to storm the platform, they were met by a fusillade of flower-pots, tables, chairs, and other missiles. They seized the platform railing in order to tear it down, but they found that under the decorations barbed wires were concealed. This gave them pause for a moment. Meanwhile, more of the invading host came from other directions. The bodyguard and members of the audience vigorously repelled the attack, wielding clubs, batons, poles, planks, or anything else they could seize, while the police laid out about right and left with their batons, their violence being far the greater. Men and women were seen on all sides with blood streaming down their faces, and there were cries for a doctor. In the middle of the struggle, several revolver shots rang out, and the woman who was firing the revolver, which I should explain was loaded with blank cartridges only, was able to terrorize and keep at bay a whole body of police. I had been surrounded by members of the bodyguard, who hurried me toward the stairs from the platform. The police, however, overtook us, and in spite of the resistance of the bodyguard, they seized me and dragged me down the narrow stair at the back of the hall. There a cab was waiting. I was pushed violently into it, and thrown on the floor, the seats being occupied by as many constables as could crowd inside. The meeting was left in a state of tremendous turmoil, and the people of Glasgow who were present expressed their sense of outrage at the behaviour of the police, who, acting under government's instructions, had disgraced the city. General Drummond, who was present on the platform, took hold of the situation and delivered a rousing speech in which she exhorted the audience to make the government feel the force of their indignation. I was kept in the Glasgow police cells all night, and the next morning was taken, a hunger and thirst-striking prisoner, to Holloway, where I remained for 5 memorable days. This was the 7th attempt the government had made to make me serve a 3 years' term of penal servitude on a conspiracy charge in connection with the blowing up of Mr. Lloyd George's country house. In the 11½ months since I had received that sentence I had spent just 30 days in prison. On March 14th I was again released, still suffering severely, not only from hunger and thirst strikes, but from injuries received at the time of my brutal arrest in Glasgow. The answer to that arrest had been swift and strong. In Bristol, the scene of great riots and destruction when men were fighting for votes, a large timber yard was burnt. In Scotland, a mansion was destroyed by fire. A milder protest consisted of a raid upon the house of the Home Secretary, in the course of which 18 windows were broken. The greatest and most startling of all protests hitherto made was the attack at this time on the Rokeby Venus in the National Gallery. Mary Richardson, the young woman who carried out this protest, is possessed of a very fine artistic sense, and nothing but the most compelling sense of duty would have moved her to the deed. Miss Richardson, being placed on trial, made a moving address to the court, in the course of which she said that her act was premeditated, and that she had thought it over very seriously before it was undertaken. She added, "I have been a student of art, and I suppose care as much for art as any one who was in the gallery when I made my protest. But I care more for justice than I do for art, and I firmly believe that when a nation shuts its eyes to justice, and prefers to have women who are fighting for justice ill-treated, maltreated, and tortured, that such action as mine should be understandable. I don't say excusable, but it should be understood. I should like to point out that the outrage which the government has committed upon Mrs. Pankhurst is an ultimatum of outrages. It is murder, slow murder, and premeditated murder. That is how I have looked at it. How you can hold women up to ridicule and contempt, and put them in prison, and yet say nothing to the government for murdering people, I cannot understand. The fact is that the nation is either dead or asleep. In my opinion, there is undoubted evidence that the nation is dead, because women have knocked in vain at the door of administrators, archbishops, and even the king himself. The government have closed all doors to us. And remember this, a state of death in a nation, as well as in an individual, leads to one thing, and that is dissolution. I do not hesitate to say that if the men of the country do not at this 11th hour put their hand out and save Mrs. Pankhurst before a few more years are past, they will stretch out their hand in vain to save the Empire." In sentencing Miss Richardson to 6 months' imprisonment, the magistrate said regretfully that if she had smashed a window instead of an art treasure, he could have given her a maximum sentence of 18 months, which illustrates, I think, one more queer anomaly of the English law. A few weeks later another famous painting, the Sargent portrait of Henry James, was attacked by a suffragette, who, like Miss Richardson, was sent through the farce of a trial and a prison sentence which she did not serve. By this time practically all the picture galleries and other public galleries and museums had been closed to the public. The suffragettes had succeeded in large measure in making England unattractive to tourists, and hence unprofitable to the world of business. As we had anticipated, the reaction against the Liberal government began to manifest itself. Questions were asked daily, in the press, in the House of Commons, everywhere, as to the responsibility of the government in the suffragette activities. People began to place that responsibility where it belonged, at the doors of the government, rather than at our own. Especially did the public begin to contrast the treatment meted out to the rebel women with that accorded to the rebel men of Ulster. For a whole year, the government had been attacking the women's right of free speech by their refusal to allow the WSPU to hold public meetings in Hyde Park. The excuse given for this was that we advocated and defended a militant policy. But the government permitted the Ulster militants to advocate their war policy in Hyde Park, and we determined that, with or without the government's permission, we should, on the day of the Ulster meeting, hold a suffrage meeting in Hyde Park. General Drummond was announced as the chief speaker at this meeting, and when the day came, militant Ulster men and militant women assembled in Hyde Park. The militant men were allowed to speak in defence of bloodshed, but General Drummond was arrested before she had uttered more than a few words. Another proof that the government had a law of leniency for militant men and a law of persecution for militant women was shown at this time by the case of Miss Dorothy Evans, our organizer in Ulster. She and another suffragette, Miss Maud Muir, were arrested in Belfast, charged with having in their possession a quantity of explosives. It was well known that there were houses in Belfast that secreted tons of gunpowder and ammunition for the use of the rebels against Home Rule, but none of those houses were entered and searched by the police. The authorities reserved their energies in this direction for the headquarters of the militant women. Naturally enough, the two suffrage prisoners, on being arraigned in court, refused to be tried unless the government proceeded also against the men rebels. The prisoners, throughout the proceedings, kept up such a disturbance that the trial could not properly go on. When the case was called, Miss Evans rose and protested loudly, saying, "I deny your jurisdiction entirely until there are in the dock beside us men who are well-known leaders of the Ulster militant movement." Miss Muir joined Miss Evans in her protest, and both women were dragged from the court. After an hour's adjournment, the trial was resumed, but the women again began to speak, and the case was hurried through in the midst of indescribable din and commotion. The women were sent to prison on remand, and after a 4 days' hunger and thirst strike were released unconditionally. The result of this case was a severe outbreak of militancy, 3 fires destroying Belfast mansions within a few days. Fires blazed almost daily throughout England, a very important instance being the destruction of the Bath Hotel in Felixstowe, valued at £35,000. The 2 women responsible for this were afterwards arrested, and as their trials were delayed, they were, although unconvicted prisoners, tortured by forcible feeding for several months. This occurred in April, a few weeks before the day appointed for our deputation to the King. I had appointed May 21st for the deputation, in spite of the fact that the King had, through his ministers, refused to receive us. Replying to this, I had written, again directly to the King, that we utterly denied the constitutional right of ministers, who not being elected by women were not responsible to them, to stand between ourselves and the throne, and to prevent us from having an audience of His Majesty. I declared further that we would, on the date announced, present ourselves at the gates of Buckingham Palace to demand an interview. Following the despatch of this letter, my life was made as uncomfortable and as insecure as the government, through their police department, could contrive. I was not allowed to make public appearance, but I addressed several huge meetings from the balcony of houses where I had taken refuge. These were all publicly announced, and each time the police, mingling with crowds, made strenuous efforts to arrest me. By strategy, and through the valiant efforts of the bodyguard, I was able each time to make my speech and afterwards to escape from the house. All of these occasions were marked by fierce opposition from the police and splendid courage and resistance on the part of the women. The deputation to the King was, of course, marked by the government as an occasion on which I could be arrested, and when, on the day appointed, I led the great deputation of women to the gates of Buckingham Palace, an army of several thousand police were sent out against us. The conduct of the police showed plainly that they had been instructed to repeat the tactics of Black Friday, described in an earlier chapter. Indeed, the violence, brutality, and insult of Black Friday were excelled on this day, and at the gates of the King of England I myself did not suffer so greatly as others, because I had advanced toward the palace unnoticed by the police, who were looking for me at a more distant point. When I arrived at the gates I was recognised by an inspector, who at once seized me bodily and conveyed me to Holloway. Before the deputation had gone forth, I had made a short speech to them, warning them of what might happen, and my final message was, "Whatever happens, do not turn back." They did not, and in spite of all the violence inflicted upon them, they went forward, resolved, so long as they were free, not to give up the attempt to reach the palace. Many arrests were made, and of those arrested many were sent to prison. Although for the majority this was the first imprisonment, these brave women adopted the hunger strike, and passed 7 or 8 days without food and water before they were released, weak and ill as may be supposed. End of Book 3, Chapter 8. Book 3, Chapter 9 of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Women's Revolution, Chapter 9. In the weeks following the disgraceful events before Buckingham Palace, the Government made several last, desperate efforts to crush the WSPU, to remove all the leaders, and to destroy our paper, the Suffragette. They issued summonses against Mrs. Drummond, Mrs. Darcy Fox, and Miss Grace Roe. They raided our headquarters at Lincoln's Inn House. Twice they raided other headquarters temporarily in use, not to speak of raids made upon private dwellings where the new leaders, who had risen to take the places of those arrested, were at their work for the organization. But with each successive raid the disturbances which the Government were able to make in our affairs became less, because we were better able, each time, to provide against them. Every effort made by the Government to suppress the Suffragette failed, and it continued to come out regularly every week. Although the paper was issued regularly, we had to use almost superhuman energy to get it distributed. The Government sent to all the great wholesale news agents a letter which was designed to terrorize and bully them into refusing to handle the paper or to sell it to the retail news agents. Temporarily, at any rate, the letter produced in many cases the desired effect, but we overcame the emergency by taking immediate steps to build up a system of distribution which was worked by women themselves, independently of the newspaper trade. We also opened a Suffragette Defense Fund to meet the extra expense of publishing and distributing the paper. Twice more the Government attempted to force me to serve the 3 years' term of penal servitude, one arrest being made when I was being carried to a meeting in an ambulance. Wholesale arrests and hunger strikes occurred at the same time, but our women continued their work of militancy, and money flowed into our protest and defense fund. At one great meeting in July the fund was increased by nearly £16,000. But now unmistakable signs began to appear that our long and bitter struggle was drawing to a close. The last resort of the Government of inciting the street mobs against us had been little successful, and we could see in the temper of the public abundant hope that the reaction against the Government, long hoped for by us, had actually begun. Every day of the militant movement was so extraordinarily full of events and changes that it is difficult to choose a point at which this narrative should be brought to a close. I think, however, that an account of a recent debate which took place in the House of Commons will give the reader the best idea of the complete breakdown of the Government in their effort to crush the women's fight for liberty. On June 11th, when the House of Commons had gone into a Committee of Supply, Lord Robert Cecil moved a reduction of £100 on the Home Office vote, thus precipitating a discussion of militancy. Lord Robert said that he had read with some surprise that the Government were not dissatisfied with the measures which they had taken to deal with the violent suffragists, and he added with some asperity that the Government took a much more sanguine view of the matter than anybody else in the United Kingdom. The House, Lord Robert went on to declare, would not be in a position to deal with the case satisfactorily unless they realised the devotion of the followers to their leaders, who were almost fully responsible for what was going on. Ministerial cheers greeted this utterance, but they ceased suddenly when the Speaker went on to say that these leaders could never have induced their followers to enter upon a career of crime but for the serious mistakes which had been made over and over again by the Government. Among these mistakes Lord Robert cited the shameful treatment of the women on Black Friday, the policy of forcible feeding, and the scandal of the different treatment accorded Lady Constance Lytton and Jane Warton. There were opposition cheers at this, and they were again raised when Lord Robert deplored the terrible waste of energy and admirable material involved in the militant movement. Although Lord Robert Cecil deemed it unjust as well as futile for suffragist members to withhold their support from the women's suffrage movement on account of militancy, he himself was in favour of deportation for suffragettes. At this there were cries of "Where to?" and "Ulster." Mr. McKenna replied by first calling attention to the fact that in the militant movement they had a phenomenon absolutely without precedent in our history. Women in numbers were committing crimes, beginning with window breaking and proceeding to arson, not with the motives of ordinary criminals, but with the intention of advertising a political cause and of forcing the public to grant their demands. Mr. McKenna, continuing, said, "The number of women who commit crimes of that kind is extremely small, but the number of those who sympathize with them is extremely large. One of the difficulties which the police have in detecting this form of crime and in bringing home the offence to the criminal is that the criminals find so many sympathizers among the well-to-do and thoroughly respectable classes that the ordinary administration of the law is rendered comparatively impossible. Let me give the House some figures showing the number of women who have been committed to prison for offences since the beginning of the militant agitation in 1906. In that year the total number of commitments to prison was 31, all the persons charged being women. In 1909 the figure rose to 156, in 1911 to 188, 182 women and 6 men, and in 1912 to 290, 288 women and 2 men. In 1913 the number dropped to 183, and so far this year it has dropped to 108. These figures include all commitments to prison and rearrest under the Cat and Mouse Act. What is the obvious lesson to be drawn? Up to 1912 the number of offences committed for which the imprisonment was the punishment was steadily increasing, but since the beginning of last year, that is to say since the new Act came into force, the number of individual offences has been very greatly reduced. On the other hand, we see that the seriousness of the offences is much greater. This statement, that the number of imprisonments had decreased since the adoption of the Cat and Mouse Act, was of course incorrect or at best misleading. The fact was that the number of imprisonments decreased because, where formerly the militants went willingly to prison for their acts, they now escaped prison whenever possible. A comparatively small number of mice were ever rearrested by the police. Mr. McKenna went on to say that he realized fully the growing sense of indignation against the militant suffragists, and he added, "Their one hope is, rightly or wrongly, that the well-advertised indignation of the public will recoil on the head of the government." "And so it will," interpolated a voice. "My honourable friend," replied Mr. McKenna, "says so it will. I believe that he is mistaken." But he gave no reasons for so believing. Referring to what he called the recent grave rudenesses which have been committed against the King, Mr. McKenna said, "It is true that all subjects have the right of petitioning His Majesty, providing the petition is couched in respectful terms, but there is no right on the part of the subjects generally to personal audience for the purpose of the presentation of the petition or otherwise. It is the duty of the Home Secretary to present all such petitions to the King, and further to advise His Majesty what action should be taken. It was, therefore, ridiculous for any suffragist to assert that there had been any breach of constitutional propriety on the part of the King in refusing, on the advice of the Home Secretary, to receive the deputation." Also, said Mr. McKenna, in view of the fact that the petition for an audience was sent by a person under sentence of penal servitude, myself, it was the plain duty of the Home Secretary to advise the King not to grant it. He referred to the incident, he said, only because it was illustrative of the militants' methods of advertising their cause. He gave them credit, he was bound to say, for a certain degree of intelligence in adopting their methods. No action has been so fruitful of advertisement as the recent absurdities which they have perpetrated in relation to the King. Coming down to the question of methods of meeting and overcoming militancy, Mr. McKenna said that he had received an almost unlimited correspondence on the subject from every section of the public. 4 methods were suggested, he said. The first, to let them die. Hear, hear. That is, I should say, at the present moment, the most popular laughter, judging by the number of letters I have received. The second is to deport them. Hear, hear. The third is to treat them as lunatics. Hear, hear. And the fourth is to give them the franchise. Hear, hear, and laughter. I think that is an exhaustive list. I notice each one of them is received with a certain very moderate amount of applause in this House. I hope to give a reason why at the present time I think we should not adopt any one of them. The first suggestion was usually, not always, based on the assumption that the women would take their food if they knew what the alternative was death. Mr. McKenna read to the House in opposition to that view the opinion of a great medical expert who had intimate knowledge of the suffragettes from the first. "We have to face the fact, therefore, that they would die," continued Mr. McKenna. "Let me say also, with actual experience of dealing with suffragists, in many cases they have got in their refusal of food and water beyond the point when they could help themselves, and they have clearly done all they could do to show their readiness to die. There are those who hold another assumption. They think that after 1 or 2 deaths in prison, militancy would cease. In my judgment there was never a greater delusion. I readily admit that this is the one issue upon which I stand, and upon which I feel I would fight to the end those who would adopt as their policy to let the prisoners die. So far from putting an end to militancy, I believe it would be the greatest incentive to militancy which could ever happen. For every woman who dies, there would be scores of women who would come forward for the honour, as they would deem it, of earning the crown of martyrdom." "How do you know?" called out an opposition member. "How do I know?" retorted the Home Secretary. "I have had more to do with these women than the honourable member, much more. Those who hold that opinion leave out of account all recognition of the nature of these women. I do not speak in admiration of them. They are hysterical fanatics. But, coupled with their hysterical fanaticism, they have a courage, part of their fanaticism, which undoubtedly stands at nothing, and the honourable member who thinks that they would not come forward, not merely to risk death, but to undergo it, for what they deem the greatest cause on earth is making, in my judgment, a profound mistake. They would seek death, and I am sure that however strong public opinion outside might be to-day in favour of allowing them to die, when there were 20, 30, 40 or more deaths in prison, you would have a violent reaction of public opinion, and the honourable gentleman who now so glibly says, 'Let them die,' would be among the first to blame the government for what he would describe as the inhuman attitude they had adopted." "That policy," continued Mr. McKenna, "could not be adopted without an Act of Parliament. For the reason I have given, I have not asked Parliament to remove from prison officials the responsibility under which they now rest for doing their best to keep those committed to their charge alive. But supposing this legal responsibility were removed from the prison officials, let the honourable members for a moment transport themselves in imagination to a prison cell and conceive of a prison doctor, a humane man, standing by watching a woman slowly being done to death by starvation and thirst, knowing that he could help her and that he could keep her alive. Did they think that any doctor would go on with such action, or that we should be able to retain medical men under such conditions in our service? I do not believe it. The doctor would think, as I should think if I saw a woman lying there, what has been this woman's offence? It may have been obstructing the police, coupled with the obstinacy derived from fanaticism which leads her to refuse food and water. Obstruct the police and she is to die. I could not distinguish, and no Home Secretary could ever say that this woman should be left to die and that that woman should not. Once we were committed to a policy of allowing them to die if they did not take their food, we should have to go on with it, and we should have woman after woman whose only offence may have been obstructing the police, breaking a window, or even burning down an empty house, dying because she was obstinate. I do not believe that that is a policy which on consideration will ever recommend itself to the British people, and I am bound to say for myself I could never take a hand in carrying that policy out. Cheers. Lord Robert Cecil's favourite remedy of deportation, Mr. McKenna dismissed on the grounds that this would be merely removing the difficulty to some other country than Great Britain. If the suggested distant island were treated as a prison, the women would hunger strike there as they did in English prisons. If the island were not treated as a prison, the suffragettes' rich friends would come and rescue them in yachts. The suggestion that the militants be treated as lunatics was also dismissed as impossible. Admitting that he had tried to get them certified as lunatics and had failed because the medical profession would not consent to such a course, Mr. McKenna said that he could not, contrary to the advice of the doctors, get certification by Act of Parliament. There remains, said Mr. McKenna, the last proposal, that we should give them the franchise. That is the right one, exclaimed Mr. William Redmond, but the Home Secretary replied, whatever may be said as to the merits or demerits of that proposal, it is clearly not one I can discuss now in Committee of Supply. I am not responsible as Home Secretary for the state of the law on the franchise, nor is there any occasion for me to express or conceal my own opinions on the point. But I certainly do not think, and I am sure the Committee will agree with me, that that could be seriously treated as a remedy for the existing state of lawlessness. Coming at last to the constructive part of his speech, Mr. McKenna told the House of Commons that the Government had one last resort, which was to take legal proceedings against subscribers to the funds of the WSPU. The funds of the Society, he said, were undoubtedly beyond the arm of the British law, but the Government were in hopes of stopping future subscriptions. We are now not without hope, he concluded, that we have evidence which will enable us to proceed against the subscribers (loud cheers) in civil action, and if we succeed the subscribers will become personally liable for all the damage done. (Cheers.) It is a question of evidence. I have further directed that the question should be considered whether the subscribers could not be proceeded against criminally as well as by civil action. (Cheers.) We have only been able to obtain this evidence by our now not infrequent raids upon the offices, and such property as we can get at of the Society. A year ago a raid was made on the offices of the Society, but we obtained no such evidence. If we succeed in making the subscribers personally responsible individually for the whole damage done, I have no doubt that insurance companies will quickly follow the example set them by the Government, and in turn bring actions to recover the cost which has been thrown upon them. If that is done, I have no doubt the days of militancy are over. The militants live only by the subscription of rich women (cheers), who themselves enjoy all the advantages of wealth secured for them by the labour of others (cheers), and use their wealth against the interests of society, paying their unfortunate victims to undergo all the horrors of a hunger and thirst strike in the commission of a crime. Whatever feelings we may have against the wretched women who for 30 shillings and £2 a week go about the country burning and destroying, what must our feelings be for the women who give their money to induce the perpetration of these crimes and leave their sisters to undergo the punishment while they live in luxury? (Cheers.) If we can succeed against them we will spare no pains. If the action is successful in the total destruction of the means of revenue of the Women's Social and Political Union, I think we shall see the last of the power of Mrs. Pankhurst and her friends. (Cheers.) In the general debate which followed, the Government were obliged to listen to very severe criticism of their past and present policy toward the militant women. Mr. Keir Hardie said in part, We may not today discuss the question of the franchise, but surely it was possible for the Home Secretary, without any transgression on the rules of the House, to have held out just a ray of hope for the future as to the intentions of the Government in regard to this most urgent question. On that point, may I say that I am not one of those who believe that a right thing should be withheld because some of the advocates of it resort to weapons of which we do not approve. That note has been sounded more than once, and if it be true, and it is true, that a section of the public outside are strongly opposed to this conduct, it is equally true that the bulk of the people look with a very calm and indifferent eye upon what is happening so long as the vote is withheld from women. Mr. Hardy concluded by regretting that the House, instead of discussing women's suffrage, was discussing methods of penalising militant women. Mr. Rupert Gwynne said, "Nobody is in a more ridiculous position than the members on the Treasury bench. They cannot address a meeting or go to a railway station or even get in a taxi cab without having detectives with them. Even if they like it, we the public do not, because we have to pay for it. It is not worth the expense that it costs to have a detective staff following a cabinet minister wherever they go, whether in a private or public capacity." Further, said Mr. Gwynne, if the Home Secretary is correct in saying that these women are prepared to die, and invite death, in order to advertise their devotion to their cause, does he really think they are going to mind if their funds are attached? Another friend of the suffragists, Mr. Wedgwood, said, "We are dealing with a problem which is a very serious one indeed. To my mind, when you find a large body of public opinion and a large number of people capable of going to these lengths, there is only one thing for a responsible House of Commons to do, and that is to consider very closely and clearly whether the complaints of those who complain are or are not justified. We are not justified in acting in panic. What it is our duty to do is to consider the rights and wrongs of these people who have acted in this way. I attribute myself no value to the vote, but I do think that when we seriously consider the question of women's suffrage, which has not been done by this House up to the present, we should remember that when you see people capable of this amount of self-sacrifice, that the one duty of the House of Commons is not to stamp the iron heel upon them, but to see how far their cause is just, and to act according to justice." When such a debate as this was possible in the House of Commons, it must be plain to every disinterested reader that militancy never set the cause of suffrage back, but on the contrary set it forward at least half a century. When I remember how that same House of Commons a few years ago treated the mention of women's suffrage with scorn and contempt, how they permitted the most insulting things to be said of the women who were begging for their political freedom, how with indecent laughter and coarse jokes they allowed suffrage bills to be talked out, I cannot but marvel at the change in our militancy so quickly brought about. Mr. McKenna's speech was in itself a token of the complete surrender of the Government. Of course, the promise of the Home Secretary that subscribers to our funds should, if possible, be held legally responsible for damages done to private property by the suffragettes was never meant to be adhered to. It was, in fact, a perfectly absurd promise, and I think that very few members of Parliament were deceived by it. Our subscribers can always remain anonymous if they choose, and if it should ever be possible to attack them for our deeds, they would naturally take refuge behind that privilege. Our battles are practically over, we confidently believe. For the present at least our arms are grounded, for directly the threat of foreign war descended on our nation, we declared a complete truce from militancy. What will come out of this European war, so terrible in its effects on the women who had no voice in averting it, so baneful in the suffering it must necessarily bring on innocent children, no human being can calculate. But one thing is reasonably certain, and that is that the cabinet changes which will necessarily result from warfare will make future militancy on the part of women unnecessary. No future government will repeat the mistakes and the brutality of the Asquith ministry. None will be willing to undertake the impossible task of crushing or even delaying the march of women toward their rightful heritage of political liberty and social and industrial freedom. The End. End of Book 3, Chapter 9. End of Book 3. End of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst.